In March 2025, King Charles was rushed to the hospital during a treatment session. The palace called it a minor bump, but something went so wrong that he had to cancel his entire schedule. For the first time since his diagnosis, the king couldn't fulfill his duties. He sent personal apologies. He was devastated. What happened in that treatment room? Why did they need to observe him for hours? The palace keeps saying everything is fine, but insiders are whispering a different story. What they're not telling you will shock you. In January 2024, Buckingham Palace made a quiet announcement that King Charles would undergo a common medical procedure for an enlarged prostate, something thousands of older men deal with every year. The palace made sure to emphasize that it wasn't serious, that it was benign, nothing to worry about. Charles, who was 75 at the time, was admitted to the London clinic on January 26th. He spent 3 nights there, with Queen Camilla visiting him daily. When he left on January 29th, he thanked the doctors and nurses, waved to the cameras, and cleared his schedule for a short recovery. Everything seemed normal, but something happened during that hospital stay that changed everything. During the prostate procedure, doctors noticed something else. They didn't say much at first. The palace later called it a separate issue of concern. Tests were done quickly, and by February 5, 2024, less than 2 weeks later, the palace made a second announcement. King Charles had cancer. It wasn't prostate cancer. It wasn't connected to the earlier issue. It was something separate, something unspoken, and something that instantly shook the entire country. Just 17 months into his reign, after taking the crown in September 2022, following the death of Queen Elizabeth II, Charles was suddenly facing something no one had expected. A life-threatening diagnosis. A king, just starting his chapter, now fighting for his life. The palace didn't say what kind of cancer it was. That silence led to endless speculation. But they did confirm that Charles had already begun regular treatments and would temporarily step back from public-facing duties. Behind the gates of the palace, he would still handle paperwork, state business, and royal decisions. The throne would not go empty. But the man who sat on it now had to fight something far more personal than a political challenge. For a monarchy shaped by silence, this was a new kind of truth. What stood out most was how open the palace chose to be. For centuries, royal health had been a secret. When monarchs held real power, any weakness was hidden. Even in modern times, it stayed that way. King George VI had lung cancer, but the public never knew until after his death in 1952. Queen Elizabeth's final health was never detailed. The official word was mobility issues, and her death certificate just said old age. But Charles broke that tradition. He chose to speak. The palace said the king had shared his diagnosis to prevent speculation, and in the hope it may assist public understanding for all those around the world who are affected by cancer. He knew the world was watching, and he wanted the truth out there. When the diagnosis came, it didn't just hit one man, it hit the monarchy. King Charles III knew the weight of it. Before the world could know, he picked up the phone himself. One by one, he called the people who mattered most. His siblings, Princess Anne, Prince Andrew, and Prince Edward, heard it from his voice directly. But it was his sons who mattered most in that moment. He told Prince William. Then he reached out across the ocean to Prince Harry. Harry was living in California, thousands of miles from London, far from the crown and all the noise that came with it. But this wasn't about royal duty. It was about a son and his father. When he got the call, Harry didn't hesitate. He dropped everything and flew across the Atlantic. On February 6, 2024, he arrived in London. he went straight to Clarence's house. The visit didn't last long, just 30 to 45 minutes, but it didn't have to. Sometimes presence speaks louder than words. And in that brief moment, whatever distance had grown between them was put aside. That same day, after speaking with both of his sons in person, the king left London and headed to Sandringham, his Norfolk estate. He needed rest, away from flashing cameras and headlines. Once the public announcement was made, the country paused. Messages poured in. People across Britain sent warm words. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak stood at the front of it all, publicly wishing the king a full and speedy recovery. He reassured the nation that the cancer had been caught early and that the king's outlook was hopeful. The message was clear. This wasn't the end. It was just a fight that had to be faced. Across the Atlantic, President Joe Biden sent his support too. He said he was concerned and wanted to speak to Charles soon. But his message to the world came through a simple tweet. He wrote, "Navigating a cancer diagnosis, treatment, and survivorship takes hope and absolute courage." He and Jill were praying for a full recovery, just like the millions who were now watching not just a king, but a man dealing with something painfully familiar. Back in Britain, Pat Price, one of the country's leading voices in cancer advocacy, said something everyone understood deep down. 1 in 2 of us may face cancer at some point. The king's openness was more than just a press release. It was a reminder. No one, not even royalty, is above the reach of illness. And in that truth, people saw something human, something shared. A few days later, around February 10, 2024, King Charles released a rare personal message. It was short, honest, and quiet in tone. He said he was deeply thankful for all the kind messages and good wishes he had received. He said those thoughts were the greatest comfort, and more than that, he was moved by how his diagnosis was helping others. It was shining a light on the work of people and groups who support families dealing with cancer every day. He said these causes had always mattered to him, but now, after what he was going through, they meant even more. They were personal. In early 2024, the world turned quiet when the news came out that King Charles had cancer. It was the kind of news that shook everything, the kind that made people stop what they were doing. But then, only days later, something even more shocking happened. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, stepped forward with her own truth. She too was battling cancer. It wasn't just one royal facing the unthinkable, it was 2. And they were the 2 the country looked up to the most. The king and the woman who would one day be queen. Kate was only 42 when she went in for what seemed like just major abdominal surgery in early 2023. The surgery was serious, but the discovery afterward was even worse. Doctors found an unspecified form of cancer. She started preventative chemotherapy soon after. And in March 2024, the world found out. She sat down, looked into the camera, and spoke with a voice that was calm but clearly shaken. She was fighting cancer too. People across Britain couldn't believe it. At the same time King Charles was starting his treatment, Kate Middleton was quietly going through her own. The king didn't stay silent. Through a Buckingham Palace spokesperson, he said how proud he was of Catherine's bravery, how she had shown real courage by speaking out. He and Queen Camilla promised to support her and the whole family through it all. It was the kind of moment the royal family rarely had. Honest, raw. 2 people, both symbols of strength, dealing with something that didn't care about crowns or palaces. For Prince William, 2024 became something else entirely. It wasn't just royal duties anymore. It was hospitals. It was worry. It was holding his children while wondering if he might lose both his father and his wife in the same year. One palace insider said it was the hardest year William had ever known, and it showed. He pulled back from public appearances. He stayed home more. He stepped into the role of caregiver while the two most important people in his life went through treatment. Kate disappeared from public life almost completely after her announcement. She spent about 2 weeks in the hospital after surgery, then many quiet months recovering at home. Chemotherapy isn't just medicine, it's exhaustion. It's days when you can't get out of bed. William helped care for their 3 young children during those long months. People waited, hoping for updates. And then, in September 2024, they got one. Kate had finished chemotherapy. She waited until January 2025 to share the next part. She was in remission. The word came like sunlight through clouds. Kate's voice was steady, but there was still weight behind her words. She said it was a relief to be in remission, but that recovery was slow. "It takes time," she said, "to find your footing again after cancer." She thanked the doctors and nurses who helped her. She thanked everyone who supported her. Her message was quiet, but it gave people hope, because she had made it through. When January 2024 came around, King Charles was already deep in something most people didn't know much about. Behind palace walls, doctors had found cancer. The exact kind stayed private, but the treatments had begun. Through the late winter and early spring, he quietly stepped away from the spotlight. He focused on rest, on healing, on staying alive. People wondered. News outlets speculated. But Charles stayed mostly quiet. Every now and then, a family member offered a soft update. In March 2024, Peter Phillips, his nephew, said the king was in good spirits but getting restless. He said Charles hated sitting still. He wanted to work. He wanted to be useful. And that frustration kept pushing against the reality of his condition. Charles kept asking his doctors and staff when he could start again. They kept telling him, "Not yet." Even as his body slowed, his mind never did. Charles had always been known for working long hours, staying up late reading state papers, writing notes in the margins, asking questions no one else thought to ask. That part of him didn't go away just because he was sick. If anything, it got louder. He was always moving, always trying. Camilla and others told him to ease up. They begged him not to push too far. His doctors were careful too. They knew treatment didn't follow a perfect clock. Some days were better than others. Some days, rest wasn't optional. But Charles never stopped wanting to return to normal. Then Easter came. On March 31, 2024, the king stepped out again. He walked into St. George's Chapel in Windsor, smiling in the spring light. It wasn't a grand appearance, just family, quiet ceremony, a few well-wishers. But to anyone watching, it was clear. He was showing the world he wasn't giving up. The cameras caught him holding flowers. He looked thin, but warm. That small step meant everything. By April, the palace announced what many had hoped to hear. Charles was coming back. Not all at once, not to everything, but enough. On April 26, 2024, they said he'd resume public duties. His treatment was still ongoing, his health still fragile. But his progress was strong enough that doctors gave a green light. They said future events would be adapted to protect his recovery. It was a balance. It had to be. And Charles understood that. But what mattered most was that he was returning. 4 days later, on April 30, 2024, he made it official. He chose his first event carefully. He and Queen Camilla visited the University College Hospital Macmillan Cancer Centre in London. There, the king met with staff and patients. He asked questions. He listened. He smiled. Someone in the crowd asked how he was feeling. He looked up and said with a small grin, "I'm all right, thank you. Not too bad." Just that. Simple, human, honest. The photos from that day showed him holding a bouquet, standing upright, speaking gently. For the people in that cancer center, seeing a fellow patient leading the way must have meant more than any speech ever could. As the weeks passed, Charles kept showing up, carefully, slowly, but always forward. By June 2024, he joined one of the grandest royal traditions of the year, Trooping the Color, his birthday parade. Usually the monarch rides on horseback, but this time Charles chose a carriage. He sat beside Camilla, wearing his military uniform, saluting the regiments as they marched past. He didn't need to be on a horse to prove anything. Just being there was enough. Just raising his hand in salute meant the world. By the end of 2024, things looked hopeful. King Charles had been balancing cancer treatment and royal duties for months. He was still showing up, still working, still standing tall in front of cameras, even when no one knew what the day might cost him. That fall, the King and Queen Camilla even left the country. They flew to Kenya, then moved on to Australia and Samoa. These weren't just ordinary trips. The Australia and Samoa leg mattered deeply, tied to holding the Commonwealth together at a time when loyalty was beginning to shift. What most people didn't know was that Charles actually paused his treatment for 11 days just to make that trip happen. His doctors gave him the green light. They believed he was strong enough to take the break, and the plan was clear. Treatment would start again as soon as he landed back in the UK. The trip went well. The schedule ran smoothly. Charles smiled through it all. And when they returned home in late October, the palace sounded more upbeat than it had in months. Officials even said that 2025 might look pretty normal. They were already sketching out a full calendar, including overseas visits. The palace staff felt confident again. One aide said the year would end on a high note because, for the first time, they could start planning like things were back to how they used to be. But cancer doesn't follow scripts. Even when it's under control, it can still turn the day upside down. That's exactly what happened just a few months later. On the morning of March 27, 2025, something went wrong. It was supposed to be just another treatment session. But during the appointment, Charles experienced side effects strong enough that he had to be taken to the hospital. The palace later said it was for a short period of observation. They tried to keep the tone light, to make it sound routine. But the timing made it serious. For the first time since his diagnosis, the king had to cancel his schedule. He had planned to meet new ambassadors that afternoon. The next day, he was supposed to spend time in Birmingham for royal engagements. Both were suddenly scrapped. The disappointment hit him hard. He sent personal apologies. He didn't want to cancel, but he had no choice. The palace repeated again and again that this was not a crisis. They called it a minor bump. One source even used those words exactly. The most minor bump in the road that's very much heading in the right direction. The same day he was taken to the hospital, he was released. By that afternoon, Charles was already back at Clarence House. Some aides even said he was working again from his study before the sun set. But still, the shadow of that day lingered. No one knew what exactly the side effects were. Maybe pain, maybe dizziness, maybe something else. They didn't say. They just stressed that this wasn't unusual. Not for cancer treatment, not for recovery. These things happen. Even with the quiet concern in the background, the palace didn't slow down. By the following week, Charles was said to be in good form again. The tone remained steady. His recovery, they said, was still moving in a very positive direction. Nothing about the plan changed, not even the next big trip. The king and queen were still set to go on a state visit to Italy in April 2025, just days after the hospital visit. And they did. They went showed up, smiled, shook hands, and finished every event on the schedule. It was a message to the world that the pause in March hadn't derailed anything. But to the public, that hospital visit was a quiet warning. After the scare in March 2025, the palace didn't stay quiet. They started sharing careful updates that balanced truth with calm. They didn't promise miracles, but they also didn't signal panic. By late spring, they began shaping a new picture of the king. He wasn't healed, but he was managing. And that word, managing, was used again and again. On May 29th, a senior royal aide stepped forward and gave a rare update. Charles, they said, was handling his illness incredibly well. The tone was measured, but hopeful. "The thing you learn about this illness is that you just manage it," the aide explained. And that's what Charles was doing. He was following medical advice and living life as normally as possible. That became the new message. The king had cancer, yes, but he was still showing up, still fulfilling his role, still the same man. The doctors around him had reason to be hopeful. Science had changed what cancer meant. It wasn't always a death sentence. Sometimes it became something people lived with for years. And that's what they believed was happening here. In June 2025, the Telegraph published a quiet but powerful line that came from behind palace walls. Charles, it said, might die with cancer, but not of cancer. That meant the disease might never go away, but it also might never end his life. It could stay in the background, kept in check by treatments and time. The palace didn't deny this. Instead, they let the idea settle. The king had a long road ahead, but he was on it, and he wasn't walking alone. There were other signs that the royal household was adjusting to a new reality. One decision stood out. Charles wouldn't be moving into Buckingham Palace. That grand symbol of monarchy was under renovation until 2027, but even after that, there were no plans to relocate. Clarence House would remain his base. The reason, insiders said, was partly his age and partly his health. There was no point in uprooting him during treatment. No need to force tradition when life was already fragile. This quiet choice said a lot. The crown could bend when it needed to. In July, the annual financial report came out. It's usually dry reading, numbers, spending, budget lines. But this one was different. The keeper of the Privy Purse, James Chalmers, added a personal note. He called 2024 a year of health challenges. Then he said 2025 had marked a return to normal business. He praised Charles's work ethic, saying the king had taken on a wide range of public and state duties both at home and abroad, all while still receiving treatment. Chalmers didn't just highlight Charles, he also credited the whole royal household for staying steady. He used words like adaptability and resilience. What he meant was simple. The monarchy hadn't cracked under pressure. It had flexed, and it had kept going. By the time autumn 2025 arrived, the official stories from the palace still sounded cheerful. But people had eyes, and the whispers were getting louder. Something was off with King Charles. He looked thinner. His face seemed pale. His suit no longer fit the way it used to. During a high-profile climate event in London, standing beside Prince William, he didn't look like the man who had stepped onto the throne with steady confidence. People in the room could feel it. One insider said he looked like someone fighting something much heavier than he was letting on. That line didn't just stay in the room. It ended up in the press, fueling a wave of speculation that the king's health wasn't as stable as the palace claimed. They kept saying he was doing well and handling light duties, but even those closest to him quietly admitted that the image was slipping. No matter how carefully the statements were crafted, people could see the difference. Behind closed doors, the staff started preparing. William was being brought in more often, being briefed more thoroughly, stepping into roles with a little more weight each time. The message was quiet but clear. If things changed quickly, they needed to be ready. One senior courtier put it bluntly: the illusion of perfect health was collapsing. That wasn't just a media line, it was reality creeping into the cracks. You couldn't Photoshop frailty. And Charles, at 76, wasn't hiding it as well as before. Some longtime watchers of the crown said what everyone else was thinking. This looked like a monarch in decline. Still, no official changes had been made. Charles was still opening his red boxes every day, reading over government documents, meeting regularly with the Prime Minister, and performing his duties as head of state. He hadn't passed anything formal to William or to Princess Anne. He hadn't stopped traveling. In July 2025, he had even welcomed the US President to London. His calendar remained full. If anything, he and Queen Camilla were still trying to show strength through routine. But under the surface, there was a quiet shift. William was more visible. Catherine was becoming even more of a public anchor. Together, they were now called the safe pair of hands, the ones people could trust if more responsibility had to be shared quickly. Charles had always supported the idea of a slimmed-down monarchy with fewer working royals and a more modern image. That plan was already in motion. The current situation was just speeding it up. But no one was talking about abdication. Not seriously. Charles wasn't planning to give up the throne. He wanted to serve as long as fate allowed, just as his mother had done. Yet the atmosphere had changed. Where there was once certainty, now there was caution. The crown still rested on his head, but everyone could see how heavy it was becoming. By late 2025, King Charles III was still standing. He hadn't stepped down. He hadn't disappeared. He was still doing the job he'd waited his whole life to do, even as cancer quietly followed him from one royal duty to the next. Behind every handshake, every photo, every quiet moment during a state visit, there were doctors. There were check-ins. There were medical updates his aides didn't want to talk about. But still, he kept showing up. At 76, nearing 77 in November, he knew the weight of the crown and carried it anyway. The palace had adjusted. They didn't cancel everything. They recalibrated. Every meeting, every ribbon cutting, every ceremony was planned with medical advice in mind. The king was still working, but nothing was casual anymore. His schedule lived under a microscope. Some said he was being brave. Others whispered that he was being stubborn. Either way, Charles didn't want pity. He didn't want to be seen as weak. He had waited decades to be king, and now, even as cancer forced him into quiet hospital corridors between events, he refused to let go of the throne. For the public, the king's struggle changed something. People started to see him not as the distant man who once talked to plants or wrote long letters to ministers, but as someone who was suddenly human, a man fighting something he couldn't command. Sympathy began to rise. Even those who once doubted him started to soften. He looked tired, yes, but he also looked real. People understood what it meant to face sickness in your 70s. Only he was doing it with cameras flashing and headlines swirling. And there were questions. What happens if the king can't open Parliament one day? What if he can't travel for a state visit? Would Prince William take over quietly, not as king, but as something close? A kind of stand-in? A shadow regent? Or would Charles, proud as ever, insist on continuing until his very last breath? No one at the palace gave a clear answer. They didn't need to. The questions were already out there, and no one could unask them. Unlike his mother, Queen Elizabeth II, Charles didn't hide his illness. The Queen kept everything private, held on until the very end, and passed at 96 without a long public fight. But Charles didn't follow that model. He chose openness. That choice alone made history. It gave comfort to people around the world going through similar treatments. Cancer patients saw a king who didn't vanish. They saw a man who still shook hands, still smiled for cameras, still stood when he could have sat, and they respected it.